Okay, so Toby, you're working on a book at the moment. Just to start off, can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, I've been working on a book for a couple of years now. And ultimately, I think with big books, this one is on existential risk. I think that they're often a little bit like an iceberg, where certainly Doing Good Better was, where there's a huge amount of work that goes on before you even decide to write the book, of coming up with these ideas and distilling them. But I'm trying to write really the definitive book on existential risk. I think the best book so far, if you're looking for something before this comes out, is John Leslie's The End of the World. But that's from 1996. That book actually inspired Nick Bostrom to some degree to get into this. And I thought about writing an academic book. There's certainly a lot of the ideas that are going to be included are cutting-edge ideas that haven't been talked about really anywhere before. But I ultimately thought that it was better to write something at the really serious end of general fiction, so that to try to reach a wider audience. That's been a really interesting aspect of writing it.
Cool. And how do you define existential risk? What counts as existential risks?
Yeah, so this is actually something where even within effective altruism, people often make a mistake here because the name is existential risk that Nick Bostrom coined is designed to be evocative of extinction. But it's really designed to say that there's extinction risk, the risk of human extinction, but there's also a whole lot of other risks which are very similar in how we have to treat them. They all involve a certain common methodology for dealing with them, in that they're risks that are so serious that we can't afford to have even one of them happen. So we can't learn from trial and error. We have to have this proactive approach. And so the way that I currently think about it is as risks that threaten the destruction of humanity's long-term potential. So extinction would obviously destroy all of our potential over the long term, as would a permanent, unrecoverable collapse of civilization if we were reduced to a pre-agricultural state again or something like that. And as would various other things that are neither extinction nor collapse. So there could be some form of permanent totalitarianism. If the Nazis had succeeded in a 1,000-year Reich, and then maybe it went on for 1,000,000 years, we might still say that was just an utter disaster that perhaps would be irrevocable. I'm not sure that at the time it would have been possible to do that with the technology of the time, but as we get more advanced surveillance technology and genetic engineering and other things, it might be possible to have lasting, terrible political states and things like that. So it includes both extinction and also these related areas.
Cool. And then in terms of what your kind of aims with the book as well, like
yeah,
change you're trying to affect.
So one of the key aims actually is one key aim is to introduce the idea of existential risk to this wider audience. I think that this is actually one of the most important ideas of our time, and it really deserves a proper airing. Try to really get all of the framing right, and then also as I said, to introduce a whole lot of new cutting-edge ideas that to do with new concepts, mathematics of existential risk, and other related ideas. Lots of the best science all kind of put into one place. So there's that aspect as well. So it's definitely a book for everyone on existential risk. I've learned a lot while writing it, actually. But also when it comes to effective altruism, I think that often we have some misconceptions around existential risk, and we also have some bad framings of it. It's often framed as if it's this really counterintuitive idea, where there's different ways of doing this. A classic one involves it could be 10 to the power of 53 people who live in the future, and if there's only things like this that make it seem unnecessarily nerdy, where you've kind of got to be a maths person to really get any pull from that argument. And even if you are a mathsy person, it feels a little bit like a trick of some sort, like some convincing argument that 1 = 2 or something, where you can't quite see what the problem is, but you're not compelled by it. Whereas actually, I think that there's room for a really broad group of people to get behind this idea, and there's no reason that my parents or grandparents couldn't be deeply worried about the permanent destruction of humanity's long-term potential. These things are really bad. And I actually think that it's not a counterintuitive idea at all. In fact, ultimately, I think that the roots of existential risk and worrying about this came from the risk of nuclear war in the 20th century. My parents were out on marches, against nuclear weapons. The biggest at the time, the biggest protest in US history was 2 million people in Central Park protesting nuclear weapons. It was a huge thing. It was actually the biggest thing in terms of, at that time, in terms of civic engagement. And so when one can see that there's a real and present threat that could threaten the whole future, people really get behind it. That's also one of the aspects of climate change, is people perceive it as a threat to continued human existence, among other things. And that's one of the reasons that motivates them. So I think that you can have a much more intuitive framing of this, because the future is so much longer than the present, that some of the ways that we could help really could be by helping this long-term future, if there are ways that we can help that whole time period.
Okay, and then looking to the next century, let's say, where do you see the main existential risks being? Like, what are all the ones that we are facing, and which are the ones we should be most concerned about?
So I think that there is some existential risk from remaining from nuclear war and from climate change. I think that both of those are kind of current anthropogenic existential risks. The nuclear war risk is via nuclear winter, where the soot from burning cities would rise up into the upper atmosphere above the cloud level so that it can't get rained out, and then would block sunlight for about 8 years or so. The risk there isn't that it gets really dark and we can't see or something like that. It's not that it's so cold that we can't survive. It's that there are more frosts, that the temperatures are depressed by quite a lot, such that the growing season for crops is only a couple of months, and there's not enough time for the wheat to germinate and so forth. And so there will be widespread famine. That's the kind of threat there. And then with climate change, they're both changes in the climate. Climate changes is warming. I think that the amount of warming that could happen from climate change is really underappreciated. There's actually a talk simultaneous with the second half of mine on this topic by John Halstead, who actually worked with me on looking at some of these things. And so I think that it's really underappreciated. The tail risk, so the chance that the warming is a lot worse than we expect, is really big. Even if you set aside the actually, I think, serious risks of runaway climate change, of big feedbacks from the methane clathrates or the permafrost, even if you set all of those things aside, scientists say that the estimate for if you doubled CO2 in the atmosphere is 3 degrees of warming. That's what would happen if you doubled it. But if you look at the fine print, they say it's actually from 1.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees. And so that's a huge range. Like, there's a factor of 3 between those estimates. And that's just a 66% confidence interval. So they actually think there's a 1 in 6 chance it's more than 4.5 degrees. So I think there's a very serious chance that if it doubled, it's more than 4.5 degrees. But also there's uncertainty about how many doublings we'll have. It could easily be the case that humanity doubles the CO2 levels twice, in which case, if you also got unlucky on the sensitivity, that would be 9 degrees of warming. And so when you often hear these things about how many degrees of warming they're talking about, they're often talking about the median of an estimate. So they're saying that if they say we want to keep it below 2 degrees, what they mean is we want to keep the median below 2 degrees, such that there's still a serious chance that it's much higher than that. So if you look into all of that, there could be very serious warming, much more serious than a lot of you get in a lot of scientific reports. But if you read the fine print in the analysis, this is in there. And so I think there's lack of really looking into that and so on. So I'm actually a lot more worried about it than I was before I started looking into this. But by the same token, though, it's difficult for it to be an existential risk. Even if there were 10 degrees of warming or something, beyond what you're reading about in the newspapers, the warming, it'd be extremely bad. Just to clarify, it's that I've been thinking about all these things as they relate to, could they directly be an existential risk, rather than could they lead to terrible situations which could then lead to other bad outcomes. But one thing is that in both cases, both nuclear winter and climate change, coastal areas are a lot less affected. There's obviously flooding when it comes to climate change. But a country like New Zealand, which is mostly coastal, would be mostly spared the effects of either of these types of calamities. Civilization, as far as I can tell, should continue in New Zealand roughly as it does today, but perhaps without low-priced chips coming in from China.
Yeah, I really think we should buy some land in New Zealand as like this hedge. I'm like completely serious about this idea.
So it's I don't actually see why it would be. Effectively, if we really, we definitely should not screw this up, right? This is a really serious problem. It's just a question I'm looking at is it an existential risk? And ultimately, it's probably better thought of as the usable areas on the Earth. They currently don't include Antarctica. They don't include various parts of Siberia and some parts of Canada, which are covered in permafrost. Effectively, the usable parts would move a bit, and they would also shrink a lot if we had this bad climate change. It'd be a catastrophe, but I don't see why that would be the end.
Yeah. Between those two, do you think climate change is kind of, by EA, is too neglected?
Yeah, actually, I think it probably is.
Yeah.
Although you don't see many people in EA looking at either of those. I think they're actually very reasonable. In both cases, it's unclear why it would be the end of humanity. And people generally in the nuclear winter research do not say that it would be. They say it would be catastrophic and maybe 90% of people could die.
Yeah.
But they don't say that it would kill everyone. I think in both cases, there's such large changes to the Earth's environment, huge unprecedented changes, that you can't rule out just that something that we haven't yet modeled happens. I mean, we didn't even know about nuclear winter until more than 30 years after the use of nuclear weapons. So there was a whole period of time when these things, new effects could have happened, and we would have been completely ignorant of them at the time where we launched the war. So there could be other things like that. And in both cases, that's where I think most of the danger of existential risk lies, just that it's such a large perturbation of the Earth system that one wouldn't be shocked if it turned out to be an existential catastrophe. So they're those ones. But I think that the things that are of greatest risk are things that are forthcoming.
Okay, terrific. So just a reminder to everybody before we get onto the really scary stuff, is if you want to ask any questions, like I'll kind of feed in questions during the interview and just use the Bizzabo app to kind of poll. So tell us about the kind of unprecedented technology.
Yeah, so the two areas that I'm most worried about in particular are biotechnology and artificial intelligence. So when it comes to biotech, there's a lot to be worried about. So if you look at some of the greatest disasters in human history, in terms of the proportion of the population who died in them, their great plagues and pandemics are in this category. The Black Death killed between 25% and 60% of people in Europe. And it was somewhere between 5 and 15% of the entire world's population. And there are a couple of other cases that are perhaps at a similar level, such as the spread of Afro-Eurasian germs into the Americas when Columbus went across and they exchanged germs. And also, say, the 1918 flu killed about 4% of the people in the world. So we've had some cases that were big, really big. Could they be so big that everyone dies? I don't think so, like the natural cases, but maybe. But it wouldn't be silly to be worried about that, but it's not my main area of concern. I'm more concerned there with advances that we've had. We've had radical breakthroughs recently. It's only it's only recently that we've discovered even that there are bacteria and viruses, that we've worked out about DNA, then that we've worked out how to take parts of DNA from one and put them into another, how to synthesize entire viruses just based on their DNA code, things like this. And these radical advances in technology have let us do some very scary things. And there's also been this extreme, it's often called democratization of this technology, but since the technology could be used for harm, it's also a form of proliferation. And so I'm worried about that. And it's very quick. The human genome was, you will probably all remember when the Human Genome Project was first announced, and that cost billions of dollars. And now a complete human genome can be sequenced for $1,000, and is kind of routine part of PhD work that you get genome sequenced. So these things have come so quickly, and other things like CRISPR and also If we look at gene drives, these were technologies, really radical things. CRISPR for putting arbitrary genetic code from one animal into another, and gene drives for releasing it into the wild and having it proliferate, that were less than 2 years between being invented by the cutting-edge labs in the world, the very smartest scientists, kind of Nobel Prize-worthy stuff, to being replicated by undergraduates in science competitions. Just 2 years. And so if you think about that, the pool of people who could have bad motives, who have access to the ability to do these things, is increasing massively from just a select group of people where you might think there's only 5 people in the world who could do it, who have the skills, who have the money, and who have the time and everything to do it, through to a thing that's much faster, and where the pool of people is in the millions. And there's just much more chance you get someone with bad motivation. And there's also states with bioweapons programs. We often think that we're protected by things like the Bioweapons Convention, the BWC. That is the main kind of protection. But there are states, we know that the Russians had been violating it for a long time. They had massive programs with more than 10,000 scientists working on versions of smallpox, and they had an outbreak when they did a smallpox weapons test, which is being confirmed. And they also killed a whole lot of people with anthrax accidentally when they forgot to replace a filter on their lab, and blew a whole lot of anthrax spores out over the city that the lab was based in. There are really bad examples of biosafety there, and also scary things that people are actually working on these things. And the US believes that there are about 6 countries in violation of this treaty. Some countries like Israel hasn't even signed up to it. So I think, and also it has the budget of a typical McDonald's, and it has 4 employees. So that's the thing that kind of stands between us and misuse of these technologies. And I really think that is grossly inadequate. So
Bioweapons Convention has 4 people working on it. How does that?
It had 3 until I had to change it in my book because a new person got involved.
How does that compare to other sorts of conventions?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
It's a good question. So they're the types of reasons that I'm really worried about developments in bio.
And yeah, what would you say to the response that it's just very hard for a virus to kill literally everybody because there are, it's a huge bunker system in Switzerland, nuclear submarines have kind of 6-month tours and so on, and that, obviously this unimaginable tragedy for civilization, but still would be enough people that over some period of time, populations would increase again.
Yeah, I mean, you could add to that uncontacted tribes and also researchers in Antarctica as other hard to reach populations. I think it's really good that we've diversified somewhat like that. I think that it would be really hard. And so I think that even if there is a catastrophe, it's likely to not be an existential disaster. But there are reasons to try to push something to be extremely dangerous. For example, as I said, the Soviets, then Russians after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were working on, they were weaponizing smallpox, they were weaponizing Ebola, it was crazy stuff. And tens of thousands of people. And they also had a whole lot of people, don't forget that they were involved in a mutually assured destruction nuclear weapons thing with a dead hand policy where they, even if their command centers were destroyed, they would force retaliation with all of their weapons. So there was this logic of mutually assured destruction and deterrence where they needed to have ways of plausibly inflicting in extreme amounts of harm in order to try to deter the US. So they're already involved in that kind of logic, and so it would have made some sense for them to do some of these terrible things, in assuming that logic makes any sense at all. So I think that there could be realistic attempts to do that.
Okay.
It is also an area where I should say that I think this is an area that's underinvested in EA. I think that in some sense there's about, I would say that the existential risk from bio is maybe about half that of AI, or a quarter or something like that. But a factor of 2 or 4 in how big the risk is. If you recall, in effective altruism, we're not interested in work on the problem that has the biggest size. We're interested in when you can do the most work, what impact you'll have. And it's entirely possible that someone would be more than a couple of times better at working on trying to avoid bio problems than they would be on AI problems. And also the community among EAs who are working on it is much smaller as well. So one would expect there's kind of good opportunities there. But it does require quite a different skill set because in bio, because a lot of the risk is misuse risk, either like lone individuals, small groups, or nation states, it's much more of a security type area where one might want to, working biosecurity might want to be talking a lot with national security programs and so forth. And one wants to, it's not the kind of thing that one wants free and open discussions of all of the different things. One doesn't also want to just say, hey, let's have this open research forum where we're just like on the internet throwing out ideas, like, well, how would you kill every last person? Oh, I know, like, what about this? Like, so we don't actually want that kind of discussion about it, which puts it in a bit of a different zone. But I think that for people who think that they actually are able to not talk about things that they find interesting and fascinating and important, which a lot of us have trouble not talking about those things. But people who could do that, and also perhaps who already have a bio background, it could be a very useful area.
Okay, so you think that EA in general is like, even though we're taking these risks more seriously than maybe most people, you think we're still neglecting it relative to
I think so.
Current EA portfolio.
And then AI, I think, is probably the biggest risk.
Yeah. Okay, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you may have heard more than you ever want to about AI risk. But basically, my thinking about this is that the reason that humanity is in control of its destiny and the reason that we have such a large long-term potential, like if you think about the set of all the things that we could achieve, if we really set our minds to it, how good could the future be, that our potential is so great, is because we are the species that's in control. For example, gorillas are not in control of their destiny. Whether they flourish or not, I hope that they will, but it depends upon human choices. We're not in such a position compared to any other species, and that's because of our intellectual abilities, both the kind of what we think of as intelligence, like problem-solving type thing, also our ability to communicate and cooperate is part of our intellectual abilities, and that's a key part of the story as well. But these intellectual abilities have given us the position where we have the majority of the power on the planet and where we have the control of our destiny. If we create some artificial intelligence, generally intelligent systems, and we make them be smarter than humans and also just generally capable and have initiative and motivation and agency, then by default, we should expect that they would be in control of our future, not us, unless we made good efforts to stop that. But the people the relevant professional community who are trying to work out how could you do that? How could you guarantee that they obey commands or that they're just motivated to help humans in the first place so you don't need to command them? They think it's really hard, and they have higher estimates of the risk than anyone else. So that's the kind of situation. There's disagreement about it, but there's also some of the most prominent AI researchers both attempting to build such generally intelligent systems. That this is their goal, to build human level or beyond general intelligence, not of the whole community, but of parts of it. They're trying to do it, and they're also very scared about it. There's a couple of them who say this is a really fringe position in AI, but they're actually just lying, or they're kind of incompetently ignorant, because they should notice that Stuart Russell and Demis Hassabis are very prominently on the record saying this is a really big issue. Yeah. So I think that just should give us a whole lot of reason to just expect, I guess creating a successor species probably could well be the last thing we do. And maybe we'd create something that also is even more important than us. And it would be a great future to create a successor. It would be effectively our children or our mind children. Maybe. But also we don't have a very good idea how to do that. We have even less of an idea about how to create artificially intelligent systems that have themselves moral status and have feelings and emotions and kind of strive to achieve greater perfections than us and so on. More likely it would be for some more trivial ultimate purpose. So they're the kinds of reasons that I'm worried about that.
And so, you hinted briefly, but what's your kind of overall, over the next 100 years, let's say, overall chance you'd assign to some existential risk event, and then how does that break down between these different risks you've suggested?
Yeah, so So I would say
Okay,
so, something like a 1 in 6 chance that we don't make it through this century. I think that there was something like a 1 in 100 chance that we didn't make it through the 20th century. Overall, we've seen this dramatic trend towards humanity having more and more power, often increasing at an exponential rate, depending on how you measure it. But there hasn't been this kind of similar increase in human wisdom. And so our power has been outstripping our wisdom. The 20th century was the first one where we really had the potential to destroy ourselves. I don't see any particular reason why we wouldn't expect then the 21st century to have our power even more outbalance our wisdom. And indeed, that seems to be the case when we also know of particular technologies that look like this could happen. And then the 22nd century, I think would be even more dangerous. I don't really see a natural end to this until we discover almost all the technologies that can be built or something, or we go extinct, or we get our act together and decide that we've had enough of that and we're going to make sure that we never suffer any of these catastrophes. And so I think that that's what we should be attempting to do. If we had a business as usual century, I don't know what I'd put the risk at for this century, a lot higher than 1 in 6. But my 1 in 6 is because I think that there's a good chance, particularly later in the century.
A lot lower than 1 in 6.
So, sorry, I think the chance that we would not make it through, the chance we suffer some kind of existential catastrophe this century is about 1 in 6. But it's the reason that it's only 1 in 6 and not, say, a half or something is because I think that there's a good chance that we will get our act together.
Oh, okay, cool. So if we just no one really cared, no one was really taking action, it would be more like 50-50.
Yeah, if it was pretty much like it is at the moment, but just kind of run forward, then I'm not sure. I haven't really tried to estimate that, but it'd be something, maybe a third or a half.
Okay. And then, so within that 1 in 6, how does that break down between these different?
Yeah, I would say, again, these numbers are all very rough. I should clarify to everyone. But I think it's useful to try to give quantitative estimates when you're giving rough numbers, because if you just say, I think it's tiny, and the other person says, no, I think it's really important, you may actually both think it's the same number, like 1% or something like that. So I think that I would say AI risk is something like 10% and bio something like 5%.
Okay. And then the others are
that's right. I think that climate change climate change wouldn't kill us this century if it kills us anyway. Yeah. And nuclear war definitely less than 1%. And probably the remainder would be more in the unknown risks category. Maybe I should actually have even more of the percentage in that unknown category. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because that was a question from the audience as well. How seriously do you take unknown existential risks? I guess they are known unknowns because we know there are some.
Yeah.
How seriously do you take them, and then what do you think we should do, if anything, to guard against them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we should take them quite seriously. If we kind of think backwards and think, what risks would we have known about in the past? We had very little idea. Only 2 people had any idea about nuclear bombs. In the 1935 or something like that, a few years before the bomb was first started to be designed. And it would have been an unknown technology for almost everyone. And if you go back 5 more years, then it was unknown to everyone. And I think that these issues about AI and maybe actually man-made pandemics. There were a few people who were talking about these things very early on, but only a couple of people, and it might have been hard to distinguish them from the noise. But I think ultimately we should expect that there are unknown risks, and then there are things that we can do about them, though. So one of the things that we could do about them is to work on things like stopping war. You mentioned Brian C. is talking on this tomorrow, which sounds fantastic. So I think that. Say, avoiding great power war. So as opposed to avoiding all particular wars, some of the wars have no real chance of causing existential catastrophe. But things like World War I or World War II or the Cold War were cases where they did have plausibility, or at least II and the Cold War. And so I think the way to think about this is not that war itself, or great power war, is an existential risk. But rather it's something else which I call an existential risk factor. And so I take inspiration in this from the global burden of disease, which looks at different diseases and shows how much does, say, heart disease cause mortality and morbidity in the world, and it adds up a number of disability-adjusted life years for that. And so they do that for all the different diseases. But then they also want to ask questions like, how much ill health does smoking cause, or alcohol? And so you can think of these things as these pillars for each of the different particular diseases. But then there's this question of cross-cutting things, where something like smoking increases heart disease and also lung cancer and various other aspects. So it kind of contributes a bit to a whole lot of these different things. And they ask the question, well, what if you took smoking from its current level down to 0? How much ill health would go away? And they call that like the burden of this risk factor. And you can do that with a whole lot of things. And not many people think about this, though, within existential risk. I think our community tends to fixate on particular risks a bit too much. And they think if someone's really interested in existential risk, they'll hear someone, oh, you work on asteroid prediction or deflection. That's really cool. You're part of the kind of in-group or the team or something. And if they hear that someone else works on global peace and cooperation, then they'll think, oh, I guess that might be good in some way. But actually, if you ask yourself, let's say, conditional upon, like, just how much existential risk is there this century? I just said 1 in 6. Mm-hmm. But if you said, what if we knew there was going to be no great power war? How much would it go down? So from say 17%, I don't know, maybe down to 10% or something like that, or it could halve. It could actually have a very big effect on the amount of risk. And if you think about, say, World War II, that was a big great power war. They invented nuclear weapons during that war as an attempt to, because of the war. And then there also started to massively escalate and invent new types of nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, because of the Cold War. So it has a history of really provoking this. And I think that this really connects in with the risks that we don't yet know about, because one way to try to avoid those risks is to try to avoid war, because war has a tendency to then try to delve into these dark corners of technology space. So I think that that's a really useful idea that people should think about. And the risk of being wiped out by asteroids is in the order of 1 in a million per century. I think probably lower. Whereas, as I just said, great power war, taking that down to 0 instead of taking the asteroid risk down to 0, is probably worth multiple percentage points of existential risk, which is way more. It's like thousands of times bigger. And while certain kind of nebulous peace type thing might have a lot of people working on it, might not be that neglected, I think trying to avoid great power war in particular, so thinking about the US and China and Russia and maybe the EU, and trying to avoid any of these poles coming into war with each other, that is actually quite a lot more neglected. So I think that there will be really good opportunities to try to help with these future risks through that way. And that's not the only one of these existential risk factors. You can think of a whole lot of things like this.
Do you have any views on how likely a great power war is over the next century then?
I would not have a better estimate of that than anyone else in the audience.
Okay, so reducing great power war is one way of these kind of unknowns. I mean, another way of kind of just making society more robust might be things like refuges or other kind of greater protection measures, backing up knowledge in certain ways. David Denkenberger's work with Allfed and so on. What's your kind of view on these sorts of activities that are about ensuring that small populations of people, after the global catastrophic but not existential risk, then are able to flourish again rather than actually just dwindle?
I mean, it sounds good. Definitely the sign is positive. How good it is compared to other kinds of direct work one could do on existential risk, I'm not sure. I think that I tend to think that it's probably, at least assuming we've got a breathable atmosphere and so on, it's probably not that hard to come back from a collapse of civilization. If you look at the history of this, it sounded like Rose is going to be talking a bit about history. I've been looking a lot when writing this book at the really long-term history of humanity and civilization. And one thing that I was surprised to learn is that the agricultural revolution, so this ability to move from a hunter-gatherer, forager type life into something that could enable civilization, cities, writing, and so forth, that happened about 5 times in different parts of the world. So sometimes people, I think, mistakenly refer to Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. That's a very Western approach. It was actually independently, there are many cradles, and there were civilizations that started in North America, South America, New Guinea, China, and Africa. So actually, I think every continent except for Australia and Europe. And that ultimately, these civilizations kind of have merged together into some kind of global amalgam at the moment. And they all happened at a very similar time, like within a couple of thousand years of each other. And so that's something where it seems to, which is basically as soon as the most recent ice age ended and the rivers started flowing and so on, then around these very rivers, these civilizations developed. So it does seem to me to be something that is not just some kind of complete fluke or something like that. And so I think that there's a good chance that that things would bounce back.
Yeah.
But work to try to help on that, particularly to do the very first bits of work. As an example, printing out copies of Wikipedia, putting them in some kind of dried out, airtight containers, and just putting them in some places scattered around the world or something, is probably this kind of cheap thing that an individual could fund, and maybe a group of 5 people could actually just do. So there's a whole, we're still in the case where there are a whole lot of things you could do, just in case type things.
I wonder how big Wikipedia is when you print it all out.
Yeah, that's just true. It could be pretty big.
You probably want to edit it somehow.
You might, yeah.
A lot on Justin Bieber and stuff.
Yeah, you don't do the Pokemon section.
Okay, so one question from the audience, which is, I think, an important part of your book, is asking about, well, what are the non-consequentialist arguments for caring about existential risk reduction as well? And something that's distinctive about your book is you're trying to unite various moral foundations.
Yeah, great. That's something that's very close to my heart. And this is part of this idea that I think that there's a really common sense explanation as to why we should care about these things. And that a lot of the cases, because people are just, it's not salient to them that there are these risks. And that's the reason that they don't take them seriously, rather than because they've thought seriously about it and they've decided that they don't care whether everything that they've ever tried to create and stand for in civilization and culture is all destroyed. I don't think that many people actually explicitly think that. But my main approach, the kind of guiding light for me, is really thinking about the opportunity cost. So it's thinking about everything that we could achieve and this kind of great and glorious future that is open to us and that we could do. And actually, the last chapter of my book really explores that and looks at the epic durations that we might be able to survive for, the types of things that happen over these cosmological timescales that we might be able to achieve. And that's one aspect. Duration, I think, is quite inspiring to me. And then also the scale of civilization could go beyond the Earth and into the stars. And I think there's quite a lot that would be very good there. But also the quality of life could be improved a lot. People could live longer and healthier in various obvious ways. But also they could, if you think about your peak experiences, like the real kind of moments that shine through at the very best moments of your life, they're so much better, I think, than the typical experiences. Such that if you just could somehow make, even within human biology, like we are capable of having these experiences which are much better, much more than twice as good as the typical experiences. And maybe we could get much of our life up to these types of levels. So I think there's a lot of room for improvements in quality as well. So these ideas about the future really are the main guide to me. But there's also these other foundations which I think also point to similar things. So one of them is a deontological one, where Edmund Burke, one of the founders of political conservatism, had this idea of the partnership of the generations. And so what he was talking about there was that we've had ultimately 100 billion people who've lived before us, and that they've built this world for us. And each generation has made improvements, innovations of various forms, technological and institutional, and that they've handed down this world to their children. And it's through that that we've achieved this greatness. Otherwise, we know what it would be like. It would be very much like it was on the savannas of Africa, for the first generations, right? Because it's not like we would have somehow been able to create iPhones from scratch or something like that. So it's everything that we've basically, if you look around, I mean, pretty much every single thing you can see, other, I guess, than the people in this room, was built up out of thousands of generations of people working together, passing down all of their achievements to their children. And it has to be. That's the only way you can have civilization at all. And then it could be that is our generation going to be the one that breaks this chain and that kind of drops the baton and destroys everything that all of these others have built? And so there's an interesting kind of backwards-looking idea there of debts that we owe and a kind of relationship we're in. And one of the reasons that so much was passed down to us was a kind of expectation of continuation of this. And so I think that's, to me, quite another moving way of thinking about this, which doesn't appeal to thoughts about the opportunity cost that would be lost in the future. And another one that I think is quite interesting is thinking a virtue approach. This is often, when people talk about virtue ethics, they're often thinking about character traits which are particularly admirable or valuable within individuals. And I've been increasingly thinking while writing this book about this at a civilizational level. So if you think of humanity as a group agent, so the kind of collective things that we do, in the same way as we might think of, say, the United Kingdom as a collective agent and talk about what the UK wants when it comes to Brexit or some question like that. That if we think about humanity, that I think we're incredibly imprudent. We take these risks, which are insane risks if an individual was taking them, where effectively the lifespan of humanity, it's equivalent to us taking risks to make the next 5 seconds, a lot better or something like that, entire risks to our whole future life. With no real thought about this at all, no explicit kind of questioning of it or even calculating it out or anything, just kind of blithely take these risks. I think that we're very impatient and imprudent. I think that we could do with a lot more wisdom. And I think that you can actually also come from this perspective, and when you look at it, it does not look like how a wise entity would be making decisions about its future. It looks incredibly juvenile and immature, and like it needs to grow up. And so I think that's another kind of moral foundation that one could come to these same conclusions through.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so another question from the audience then was about timelines on development of general artificial intelligence, or plug in some precise definition there. What are your kind of views on that? How's that changed over the course of like the book, if at all, as well?
Yeah, so I guess my feeling on timelines has certainly changed over the last 5 or 10 years. Ultimately, the deep learning revolution has gone very quickly, and there really are, in terms of the remaining things that need to happen before you get artificial general intelligence, there aren't that many left. And progress seems very quick, and there don't seem to be any fundamental reasons why the current wave of technology couldn't take us all the way through to the end. Now, it may not. I hope it doesn't, actually. But I think that would just be a bit too fast, and we'd have a lot of trouble handling it. But I can't rule out it happening in, say, 10 years or even less. Seems unlikely, but I guess my best guess for a kind of median estimate, so as much chance of it happening before this date as happening after this date, would be something like 20 years from now. And when it comes to these estimates, though, it's interesting to, but I think also if it took more than 100 years, I wouldn't be that surprised. I'd allocate, say, 10% chance or more to it taking longer than that. But I do think that there's a pretty good chance that it happens within, say, 10 to 20 years from now. Maybe there's like a 30, 40% chance it happens in that interval. And so that is quite worrying because this is a case where I can't rely on this idea that humanity will get its act together. I think ultimately the case with existential risk is fairly clear and compelling. This is something that is worth a significant amount of our attention and is one of the most important priorities for humanity. But we might not have been able to make that case over those time periods. So it does worry me quite a bit. Another aspect here, which gets a bit confusing and is sometimes confused within effective altruism, is trying to think about the timelines that you think are most plausible. So you can imagine a probability distribution over different years and when it would arrive. But then there's also this aspect that, that your work would have more impact if it happened sooner. And I think this is a real thing, such that if AI is developed in 50 years' time, then the ideas we have now about what it's going to look like are more false. And so trying to do work now that involves these current ideas will be more short-sighted about what's actually going to even help with the problem. And also there'll be many more people who have come to work on the problem by that point. So it'll be much less neglected by the time it actually happens. Whereas if it happens sooner, it'll be much more neglected. So your relative, your marginal impact on the problem is bigger if it happens sooner. So you could start with your overall distribution about when it's going to happen, and then modify that into a kind of impact-adjusted distribution about when it's going to happen. And that's ultimately the kind of thing that would be most relevant to when you think about it. Mm-hmm. So effectively, this is perhaps just unnecessarily fancy way of saying one wants to hedge against it coming early, even if you thought that was less likely. But then you also don't want to get yourself all confused and then think it is coming early because you had because you somehow messed up this rather complex process of thinking about your leverage changing over time as well as the probability changing over time. And I think people often do get confused. They then decide they're going to focus on it coming early, and then they forget that they were focusing on it because of leverage considerations, not probability considerations.
In response to the hedging, what would you say to the idea that well, in very long timelines, we can have unusual influence. So supposing it's coming in 100 years' time, I'm like, wow, I have this 100 years to kind of, grow. Perhaps I can, invest my money, like build, hopefully exponentially growing movements like effective altruism and so on. And this kind of patience, this ability to think on such a long time horizon, that's itself a kind of unusual kind of superpower or way of having leverage.
That's a great question. So I think I've thought about that a lot, and I've got a short piece on this online. I can't remember what it's called.
The timing of labor aimed
at
existential
yes, it's not a great name. The timing of labor aimed at existential risk reduction or something like that. And what I was thinking about was just this question about, suppose you're going to do a year of work. Is it more important that that year of work happens now, or that a year of work happens closer to the crunch time, like when the risks were there? And you can apply this to other things as well as existential risk as well. And ultimately, I think that there are some interesting reasons that push in both directions, as you've suggested. So the big one that pushes towards later work, such that you'd rather have the year of work be done kind of in the immediate vicinity of the difficult time period, is something I call nearsightedness. So we just don't know what the shape of the threats are. I mean, as an example, it could be that now we think AI is bigger than bio, but then it turns out within 5 or 10 years' time, there's been some radical breakthroughs in bio, and we think bio is the biggest threat. And then we think, I'd rather have been able to switch my labor into bio. So that's an aspect where it's better to be doing it later in time, other things being equal. But then there's also quite a few reasons why it's good to do things earlier in time. And these include what you were suggesting, like growth, that there are various things to do with your money in a bank or investment could grow, such that you do the work now, you invest the money's much bigger, and then you pay for much more work later. Obviously, there's growth in terms of people and ideas. So you do some work growing a movement, then you have thousands or millions of people try to help later instead of just a few. Also, growing an academic field works like that. A lot of things do. And then there's also other related ideas like steering. If you're going to do some work on steering the direction of how we deal with one of these issues, you want to do that steering work earlier, not later. It's like in the kind of idea of like diverting a river. You want to do that closer to the source of the river. And so there's various of these things that push in different directions, and they help you to work out for different things you're thinking of doing. I like to think of this as a portfolio, in the same way as we think perhaps of a EA portfolio of what we're all doing with our lives. It's not the case that each one of us has to mirror the overall portfolio of important problems in the world, but what we should do together is kind of contribute as best we can to humanity's portfolio of work on these different issues. Similarly, you could think of a portfolio over time of all the different bits of work and which ones are best to be done at which different times. So now it's better for kind of thinking deeply about some of these questions, trying to do some steering, trying to do some growth. And whereas direct work is often more useful to be done later. There are some exceptions. For example, it could be that with AI safety, you actually need to do some direct work just to prove that there's a there. And I think that that is actually, so effectively direct work on AI safety at the moment, the main benefit of it is actually that it helps with the growth of the field. So anyway, there are a few different aspects on that question, but I think that our portfolio should involve both these things. I think there's also a pretty reasonable chance that, indeed that AI comes late, or that the risks come late and so on, such that the best thing to be doing was growing the interest in these areas. In some ways, my book is a bet on that, to say it would be really useful if this idea had a really robust and good presentation, and to try to do that and present it in this right way so that it has the potential to really take off and be something that people all over the world take seriously, and to be all thought out. Obviously, that's in some tension with the possibility AI could come in 5 years, or some other risk, bio risk could happen really soon, or nuclear war or something like that. So, but I think ultimately our portfolio should involve both those things.
Terrific. Well, we've got time for one last short question. First question that was on the Bizzabo. Will it be an audiobook?
Yes.
Will you narrate it?
Maybe.
I really think Nathan Lebenz should narrate all EA. Like lovely caramel voice. Okay, cool. We had better wrap up, but thank you so much for taking the time to answer all these questions. And will you be around?
I will. I've got office hours for the next half hour, and then I'll be around all day as well. So try to grab me and have a chat if you're interested in some of these things.
Great. Well, let's thank Dr. Toby Ord.